So before we get started with Kant, I think it's good to say something, to give you guys something in the way of a short introduction. And I think this for two reasons. One, the reading is just long. I mean, this is an excerpt from the larger groundwork, but it's still pretty long, right? And I think with a long reading, there's always the danger we're going to lose our way. Having a sort of map, a sort of guide to what's going on, I think is useful. And two, Kant can be pretty hard. I gave you guys the early modern texts translation, and the translator, Bennett, does what he can to make Kant simple, but there's only so much you can do without, just not being true to what Kant wrote. His writing is hard to read, which is another reason I think it will help to know what's going on here. All right. So first off, let's look at the argument of the groundwork in outline. And, I think we can phrase this as sort of question and answer, and this is sort of each step of Kant's argument, right? You can also think of this as sort of a road. These are like the landmarks on the way, right? And, our question might be, do we want to follow Kant all the way to the end? But it'll be worth seeing, well, what's each step here? So Kant starts by talking about the unconditionally good, good in all possible circumstances. What is that? If it's unconditionally good, you can't imagine a case or a way that it could be bad. Kant's answer here is the good will. Well, then we have to define the good will, right? What is a good will? What makes it good? What characterizes it? Kant says, well, the good will is a will that acts from the motive of duty. All right, that brings us to yet another question. What is duty? If a good will is one that does its duty because it is its duty, acts from the motive of duty, then we need to know what duty is. Kant says, well, these categorical imperative tests, the formula of humanity, the formula of universal law, they tell us what duty is. We'll take those in the order of formula, universal law, then formula of humanity. These are supposed to help us to define what duty is. You'll notice also the abbreviations here. Saying formula universal law, especially formula universal law, over and over and over again gets to be kind of a mouthful. I'll sometimes abbreviate it as the FUL. Formula humanity, not quite as long to say, but still, I'll sometimes abbreviate it as the FH. So that's Kant's argument in outline. We will start talking about the details of that argument next time. Before we do, though, I think it's worth saying a little bit about the method of the groundwork, Kant's method in ethics. And so what Kant thinks he's doing is he's just making explicit what we think about morality, explicit and systematic. Kant says, you actually believe all the stuff I'm saying, I'm just making it clearer to you, making it really explicit. You might have to reflect on this, you might have to think through all the implications of what Kant says, but if you do that, he thinks you will agree. This is what morality is. If you don't agree, because Kant takes that to be his method, that is a problem for him, right? Now, one thing you might ask, well, if Kant's just doing this, if he's just making explicit and systematic what we already know about morality, well, then what's the point? Why read this very hard book if we already know what it says? What's the point, right? Right, I said to keep this in mind as we look at all these. What is the point of an ethical theory? Why does the author think we should do this? And I think Kant has two reasons for presenting an ethical theory. One, by making explicit and precise what we already think, we can make our ethical judgments more precise and clearer. We can do better making these judgments. We can also be clear about the grounds for those judgments. Two, and this will be a constant theme throughout Kant, making what morality requires precise and clear, what morality is, Kant says will make it harder for us to deceive ourselves about what morality requires from us. And Kant thinks this is a big problem. We know what we should do, but we are also, Kant thinks, very good at deceiving ourselves and telling ourselves that, well, what morality requires is easier than what it really requires, right? We'll talk a bit as we get more into Kant's moral theory how this works and what he thinks it looks like. All right. The last thing I want to talk about, and I think this is important, is the logic of Kant's arguments. And by this, people use logic in a lot of sloppy ways. By this, I literally mean the logic of the argument, the way the argument is supposed to work, the form it's supposed to have. And throughout the groundwork, Kant uses a form of argument known as argument by elimination. We'll see this even next time. And the basic form of an argument by elimination looks like this. A or B, not A, so B. You see this a lot. If you like murder mysteries, you'll see an argument by elimination a lot, right? Either the butler or the gardener did it. The butler couldn't have done it because he had an alibi, so the gardener did it, right? That is a basic form of argument by elimination, right? See that you might see this when you're thinking of buying something, right? You should either, I can't think of but people do this all the time with buying stuff, right? You should either get an iPhone or a Google phone. Well, there's some reason not to get the iPhone, so get the Google phone, right? Basic form of argument by elimination. Now keep in mind, the argument by elimination is often more complicated, right? There are more alternatives and we often need to eliminate all of them. A, B, C, or D. If you want to get A, which is the conclusion here, you have to eliminate every one of these options. Not B, not C, not D, so A, right? Again, you might see this in a murder mystery. Either the butler, the gardener, the ex-wife, or the business partner did it. So, it's not the butler. Let's say he had an alibi, not B, not the gardener. He also had an alibi. Maybe he was drinking at a bar with the butler and everybody saw him there. D, not the business partner. Well, he was out of the country. So it's the wife, right? I can't remember if this is the way I signed the letters here, but, you see this, if you like murder mysteries in the big denouement where they're like, the detective gathers everybody together to say who it is. He eliminates people this way, right? Now look, arguments from elimination work only if two conditions are satisfied. Only if all the relevant alternatives, all the possibilities are listed, and if they are actually eliminated. If you give reasons to think we can't, throw out these other possibilities. And there's a lot of ways to mess this up, right? So one way you might say the only people who could have committed the murder are the victim's wife, Aunt Sally, his business partner, or the gardener. His business partner and wife were seen together at a bar by 5 different witnesses when the murder occurred, so it must have been the gardener, right? This doesn't work because it doesn't eliminate Aunt Sally, right? A, B, C, or D, not A or B, so not D. We have C as an alternative we need to eliminate. There's different ways of making this mistake. Maybe the detective lists Aunt Sally and just doesn't eliminate her. She's sweet, she's old, whatever. More commonly, he just won't even think of her, right? She's a real possibility, but he just leaves her out. A, B, or C, not A and not B, so C, right? But really it's A, B, C, or D, and we're not eliminating D. When you do this, when you fail to consider and eliminate all the alternatives, your argument commits what's called the fallacy of false choice. Now, a lot of times this is called a false dichotomy because people will propose really opposed alternatives. We should either intervene in the Ukraine war, send our own troops, or do nothing. We shouldn't intervene, so we should do nothing. Right? That's a bad argument because those aren't all the relevant alternatives. That's the fallacy of false choice. Now, the question I want you guys to keep in mind is, does Kant do this? Are there alternatives that he should consider in his arguments by elimination he overlooks? I think there are, and I will talk about these as we go through them, right? And this is not because Kant is stupid or Kant is trying to deceive us. I think just some things seem so obvious to Kant that he doesn't think he needs to consider them, and they're not that obvious, at least not to us. There's some options Kant should consider that he just doesn't even think about because they just seem obviously wrong to him. We need to look at them, and I will do this. I'll try to think of what Kant might have said or should have said about these as we go through. Another thing to think about, in the options Kant considers, does he always give us good reason to eliminate them? It's another way, as we go through Kant's argument, I'm going to put a little bit of pressure on it. All right. So all that in the way of an introduction. Let's get into Kant's actual argument.